Easterlings. Enter the history of Middle-earth at the first sunrise. When the sun rose for the first time in the far eastern land of Hildorian, the younger children of Ilúvatar awoke and looked upon its light. These first men spread across the eastern lands, and many came under the shadow of Morgoth, who had already corrupted and tormented their kindred in the years before the Eldar discovered them. Some groups resisted that shadow and began the long migration westward toward the lands of Beleriand, where they encountered the elves and became known as the Edain, the elf friends. Others remained in the east, and from these eastern peoples the histories of Middle-earth would later gather under the broad and imperfect umbrella of the name Easterlings. The term never described a single kingdom or a unified people. It served as a chronological label applied by Western chroniclers to many separate groups dwelling in the vast lands around the Sea of Rhûn and beyond, lands whose internal politics, cities and cultures Tolkien's sources leave largely unmapped. In the First Age, two Easterling peoples entered Beleriand and entered the service of elven lords. Bor led his people to Maedhros, son of Fëanor, and his sons Borlad, Borthand, and Borlus proved faithful. Ulfang the Black brought his people to the service of the sons of Fëanor as well, and his sons Ulfast, Ulwarth, and Uldor swore loyalty to Caranthir. During the Nanathan Oediad, the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, the loyalty of these two groups diverged with devastating consequences. Bor's sons fought faithfully for the union of Maedhros and died in battle against the forces of Morgoth. Ulfang's sons betrayed the union at the critical moment, turning their weapons against the elves they had sworn to serve. The treachery of Ulfang's people broke the eastern flank of the elven host and ensured the catastrophe of the Nirnath. Morgoth rewarded Ulfang's followers by granting them the land of Hithlum to dwell in, but that reward became a sentence. The Easterlings of Hithlum enslaved the remaining men of the house of Hador who had not gone to war, ruling over them as harsh masters, until the War of Wrath shattered Morgoth's power and sank Beleriand beneath the sea. After the First Age, the Easterlings of the broad eastern lands appear in the chronicles of Middle-earth primarily through their conflicts with the western kingdoms of men. The lands of Rhûn remained vast and largely unknown to the scribes of Gondor and Arnor, who recorded invasions and wars without ever describing the homelands from which the attackers came. The Wainriders emerged from the east in the mid-Third Age as a confederation of peoples who travelled in great wains, armed war chariots that gave them their name, and had devastating mobility on the open plains of Rhovanion and Calenardon. The Balcoth followed in later centuries, another eastern people who pressed against Gondor's northern frontiers. Camul, one of the 9 Nazgûl, was of Easterling origin, and his presence among Sauron's servants tied the eastern peoples to the long designs of Mordor. At Pelennor and at the Battle of Dale, Easterling armies marched among Sauron's forces, their axes and banners recorded by the defenders of Minas Tirith and Erebor. After the fall of Sauron, Aragorn Elessar pardoned those Easterlings who laid down their arms, and the embassies of the reunited kingdom travelled east in the Fourth Age to renew relations with peoples whose names and histories the Western chronicles had never fully recorded. Númenor begins with a gift and a choice. After the War of Wrath destroyed Morgoth and sank Beleriand, the Valar rewarded the Edain who had fought beside the elves against the Dark Lord. They raised a great star-shaped island from the sea between Middle-earth and Aman, and they gave it to the Edain as their own kingdom. The Edain sailed to this island in the early Second Age and named it Númenor, the Westerness, and they crowned Elros, son of Eärendil and brother of Elrond, as their first king. Elros chose to be counted among men, accepting the gift of mortality that the Valar had decreed for humankind, while Elrond chose the path of the Eldar. Elros Tar-Manyutur ruled for 410 years, for the Valar granted the Númenorians a lifespan far exceeding that of other men, and under his descendants the island kingdom grew in wisdom, craft and power. The Númenorians became the greatest mariners the world had known, building ships that sailed to every shore of Middle-earth, and even, in the earliest centuries, to the coasts of Aman itself. Their craftsmen wrought works of metal and stone that surpassed the skill of other mortal peoples, and their captains established havens and trading posts along the western and southern coasts of Middle-earth, bringing goods, knowledge, and the culture of a gifted people to the men who dwelt in those lands. At the heart of Númenorian civilization stood the White Tree of the king's court, descended from the tree Galathilion that the elves of Valinor had given to the Númenóreans as a symbol of their friendship with the Eldar. The tree stood in the king's courtyard in the city of Armenelos, and its health and flowering became a sign of the kingdom's spiritual condition. On the holy mountain of Meneltama, the Númenóreans worshipped Ilúvatar in the open air, 3 times a year ascending the slopes in silence to offer prayer. The ban of the Valar forbade the Númenóreans from sailing west beyond the sight of their own shores, so that they would not attempt to set foot on the undying lands of Aman, which did not belong to mortal men. For many centuries the Númenóreans honored the ban, and their ships sailed east and south and north, but never west to the forbidden horizon. As the kingdom grew in power, however, a division opened among the people. The faithful, called the Elendili, remained loyal to the Valar and the friendship of the elves, preserving the old customs and the elvish tongues. The king's men grew proud in their wealth and longevity, resenting the ban and the gift of death that it implied, and they turned their gaze toward power and dominion over other lands and peoples. The Númenóreans established great havens on the coasts of Middle-earth, and from these outposts their influence spread deep into the continent. Some of the king's men who settled in these havens became known as Black Númenóreans, and they ruled over the men of Middle-earth with cruelty, serving their own ambition rather than the old alliance of the Edain. The might of Númenor reached its peak under the kings of the later centuries, and their armies and fleets could challenge any power in the world. Sauron, the Dark Lord who had risen again in Middle-earth after the destruction of his master Morgoth, perceived the growing power of Númenor and moved against it. But the Númenóreans under their king Ar-Pharazôn sailed to Middle-earth with a force so vast that Sauron's armies fled without battle. Ar-Pharazôn took Sauron captive and brought him back to Númenor as a prisoner, and this capture proved the kingdom's undoing. Sauron, who had been brought in chains, used his cunning and his tongue to win the trust of Ar-Pharazôn and the court of Númenor over the course of years. He played upon the king's fear of death and his pride of power, and he persuaded Ar-Pharazôn that the Valar had deceived him, that the ban was a lie designed to keep the Númenóreans from claiming the immortality that rightfully belonged to the greatest of mortal peoples. Sauron urged the king to build a great fleet and sail west to Aman itself, to take the undying lands by force and seize the immortality that the Valar withheld. Ar-Pharazôn assembled the greatest fleet Númenor had ever seen, and in the year 3319 of the Second Age he sailed west, breaking the ban of the Valar and setting foot on the shores of Aman. The Valar laid down their guardianship and appealed to Ilúvatar, and Ilúvatar opened the sea and swallowed the fleet and the island together. Númenor sank beneath the waves in a single night, and the mountain of Meneltama went down under the water, and the civilization that the Valar had raised as a gift to the faithful Edain was destroyed by the choice of its last king. Sauron's body perished in the downfall, but his spirit fled back to Middle-earth, stripped of the fair form he had worn in Númenor, but still possessed of his malice and his will to dominate. The faithful, led by Elendil and his sons Isildur and Anarion, had refused to join the fleet of Ar-Pharazôn. They had prepared their own ships and loaded them with their families, their followers, and the treasures of the old loyalty. Isildur had rescued a seedling of the white tree from the court of Armenelos before the downfall, risking his life to take it from under the guard of Sauron's followers, and he carried it aboard the ships of the faithful. Elendil also brought the Palantiri, the seeing stones that had been given to the Númenóreans by the elves of Valinor in the early days of the kingdom, and these stones and the white tree seedling would become the most precious relics of the realms the faithful founded in Middle-earth after the drowning of their island home. Arnor was the northern kingdom of the Dúnedain in Middle-earth, founded by Elendil in the year 3320 of the Second Age, the year after the downfall of Númenor. Elendil and his sons Isildur and Anarion had sailed east with 9 ships of the faithful, and the winds and seas had carried them to the shores of Middle-earth. Elendil landed in the north, in the region of Erebor, and there he established his kingdom. Arnor encompassed a vast territory between the Misty Mountains and the Blue Mountains, holding both the Númenorian exiles and the middlemen who had lived in Eriador for centuries, descendants of the Edain who had not gone to Númenor, and of other peoples related to the Edain by blood. Elendil built his capital at Annúminas, a city on the shores of Lake Nenúail in the north of Eriador, and there he placed one of the Palantiri, the seeing stones he had brought from Númenor. The kingdom's northern and southern halves were connected by the Great Road, which ran from the Blue Mountains through Bree and across the lands of Arnor to the passes of the Misty Mountains, and along this road the traffic of the kingdom flowed. Elendil ruled Arnor as High King of both the northern and southern realms, for his sons Isildur and Anarion had landed farther south and had founded the kingdom of Gondor. After the War of the Last Alliance, in which Elendil and Gil-galad fell in combat with Sauron and Isildur cut the One Ring from Sauron's hand, Isildur returned north to Arnor to take up the kingship. He never reached Annúminas. Orcs ambushed him at the Gladden Fields, and the ring was lost in the Anduin, and Arnor lost its king before the kingdom had found its footing in the New Age. Isildur's youngest son Valandil survived in Rivendell, and he eventually took the crown of Arnor, but the kingdom had already begun to suffer from the loss of population and the thinning of the Númenorian bloodline that would mark its long decline. The kingdom of Arnor divided in TA 861 after the death of King Eärendil. His 3 sons could not agree on a single heir, and they partitioned the realm into 3 smaller kingdoms. Arthedain occupied the northwest, centered on the old capital of Annúminas and the later seat at Fornost, and its kings claimed the high kingship of all the northern Dunedain. Cardolan held the southern lands between the rivers Baranduin and Gwathlo, and Rhudaur controlled the northeast, a poorer and less populated region where the Dunedain were always a minority among the hillmen of the area. The 3 kingdoms quarrelled over the Palantir at Amon Sul, the watchtower of Weathertop, which stood in Arthedain but whose territory was disputed by all 3. This division weakened the northern Dunedain at the moment when a new enemy was rising in the north. The kingdom of Angmar appeared in the far north of the Misty Mountains around TA 1300, and its ruler, the Witch King, was the lord of the Nazgûl, the chief servant of Sauron. Angmar gathered the hillmen of Rhudaur and the orcs of the mountains and launched a long war of attrition against the divided kingdoms of the Dúnedain. Rhudaur fell first, its Dúnedain rulers overthrown and replaced by men loyal to Angmar. Cardolan was overrun, and its last prince died in the Barrow Downs, and the land became a haunted waste. Arthedain held out longest, its kings defending Fornost and the northern marches against repeated assaults. In 1409, the forces of Angmar besieged Amon Sul and destroyed the tower, though the Palantir was saved and carried back to Fornost. The Great Plague of 1636 devastated what remained of the population of Cardolan and southern Arthedain, and the lands that had once been cultivated and settled reverted to wilderness. The Witch King launched his final assault in 1974, overrunning Fornost and driving the last king of Arthdale into the northern hills. King Ardui fled westward and northward, and he perished in the ice bay of Forochel, and the Palantiri of Annúminas and Amon Sul were lost in the sea. The forces of Gondor, led by Arnor, arrived too late to save Arthedain, but defeated the Witch King at the Battle of Fornost in 1975, and the forces of Angmar were scattered. Glorfindel, the elf lord of Rivendell, pursued the Witch King and prophesied that no man would destroy him. The kingdom of Arnor had ended, but the line of its kings survived. The descendants of the kings of Arthedain took the title of chieftain of the Dúnedain and became the Rangers of the North, a scattered and secret people who guarded the lands of Erebor without crown or city. They patrolled the Great Road and the borders of the Shire, protecting the small folk who had settled in the old lands of Arthedain without knowing the identity of their silent guardians. The sons of the chieftains were fostered in Rivendell, where Elrond preserved the lore and the heirlooms of the House of Isildur, including the shards of Narsil and the sceptre of Annúminas. Aragorn, son of Arathorn, was the last of these fostered sons, raised in Rivendell under the name Estel, and he carried the blood of Elendil and the claim to the crown of Arnor through centuries of wandering and war, until his victory restored both kingdoms under a single king. Gondor was the southern kingdom of the Númenorian exiles in Middle-earth, and its history is the longest and most detailed of any realm of men in the later chronicles. Isildur and Anarion, the sons of Elendil, landed in the south after the downfall of Númenor, and they founded Gondor in the same year as Arnor, 3320 of the Second Age. They built their kingdom in the rich lands between the White Mountains and the Anduin, a region that had already been inhabited by men related to the Edain and by Númenorian colonists who had settled there in the centuries before the downfall. The brothers established 3 great cities. Minas Ithil, the Tower of the Rising Moon, stood on the eastern border, built by Isildur in the foothills of the Mountains of Shadow. Minas Anor, the Tower of the Setting Sun, stood on the western side beneath the White Mountains, built by Anarion. Between them, on both banks of the river Anduin, they raised Osgiliath, the greatest city of the kingdom, spanned by stone bridges and crowned with the Dome of Stars, where the chief palantir of the south was kept. They also built the fortress of Orthanc in the valley of Isengard, a tower of indestructible black stone, and placed another palantir there. The War of the Last Alliance tested the young kingdom in its first century. Sauron had returned to Mordor and had gathered his forces, and Elendil and Gil-galad marched from the north with the host of Arnor and the elves of Lindon, while Isildur and Anarion defended Gondor against the assaults from the east. The siege of Barad-dûr lasted 7 years, and Anarion was killed by a stone cast from the walls, and Elendil and Gil-galad fell in single combat with Sauron. Isildur cut the One Ring from Sauron's hand with the shards of his father's sword Narsil, and Sauron's spirit fled, and the war was won. Isildur kept the ring rather than destroying it, and when he rode north to Arnor, he was killed at the Gladden Fields, and the ring was lost. The throne of Gondor passed to Anarion's son Meneldil, and the kingship of the south and the high kingship of the north diverged, though the two realms remained allied, and the line of Isildur retained its claim to the overlordship of both. Gondor's power grew through the first millennium after Númenor's downfall. The kings expanded the borders southward and eastward, pushing the frontiers to the Sea of Rhûn and the borders of Harad. The ship kings of the line of Anarion built great fleets and extended Gondor's dominion along the coasts, taking the haven of Umbar and establishing garrisons and provinces across the southern lands. Under King Hyamendasil I, who reigned in the 12th century of the Third Age, Gondor reached the height of its territorial power. Hyamendasil defeated the Haradrim and the Easterlings, and extended the kingdom's sway from the mouths of Anduin to the edges of Rhûn, and no enemy dared challenge Gondor's might during his long reign. The White Tree of Gondor, descended from the seedling that Isildur had brought from Númenor, flowered in the court of the citadel of Minas Anor, and the kingdom's wealth and population filled its cities and provinces. The decline of Gondor began with the Kinstrife, a civil war that tore the kingdom apart in TA 1437. King Vanakar had married Vidumavi, the daughter of a Northman lord of Ravanian, and their son Eldakar was of mixed Númenorian and Northman blood. The pure-blooded factions of Gondor rejected Eldakar's claim, and when he took the throne, the usurper Castamir, a descendant of the line of Anarion through a younger branch, seized the crown by force. Castamir besieged Eldakar in Osgiliath and captured the city, and the bridges and the Dome of Stars were destroyed in the fighting. Eldakar fled to Ravanion and gathered the Northmen to his banner, and he returned to defeat Castamir, who was killed, and the rightful king was restored. Castamir's sons and followers fled to Umbar and seized the haven, and from that base they launched the corsair raids that would plague Gondor's coasts for centuries. The Kinstrife had cost Gondor much of its fleet, much of its population, and the unity of its ruling house, and the kingdom never fully recovered. The Great Plague of 1636 struck Gondor at its weakened moment. The plague spread from the east and swept through the cities and provinces, killing King Telemnar and his children, and devastating the garrisons along the borders. The White Tree in the court of Minas Anor withered and died, and a seedling was found and planted in its place, but the kingdom's hold on its outer territories was broken. The forts along the Anduin were abandoned, and the watch on Mordor was relaxed, and the plague carried off much of the population that had once manned the frontier defences. The Wainriders, a confederation of Easterling peoples who travelled in war chariots, struck Gondor in the 19th century and inflicted a series of defeats that pushed the kingdom to the edge of destruction. King Onderher and both his sons were killed in battle against the Wainriders in 1944, and the line of the kings of Gondor was nearly extinguished. Ernil, a general of the southern army, defeated the Wainriders in a counterattack and saved the kingdom, and he was crowned king, but the northern line of Isildur had been reduced to the scattered ranges of the north, and the two kindreds of the Dundain had grown far apart. The Balcoth, another eastern people, invaded the northern plains of Gondor in 2510, and the garrison of Khalanar Don could not hold them. Sirion, the steward of Gondor, sent messengers north to the Eotheod, the people of the Northmen who dwelt near the sources of the Anduin, and their lord Eorl answered the call with a cavalry that rode south to the field of Celebrant and broke the Balcoth. Cirion granted the land of Calenardon to Eorl and his people, and the kingdom of Rohan was born from that grant, and the oath of Eorl bound the two realms in alliance for the rest of the Third Age. The Stewards of Gondor had begun as temporary custodians of the throne, but the disappearance of King Arnor in 2050 made their office permanent. Arnor rode to Minas Morgul to answer the challenge of the Witch King, and he was never seen again, and he left no heir. Mardil Voronwe, the steward of that time, continued to rule in the king's name, and the stewards who followed him held the throne in trust for a king who would return. The ruling stewards governed Gondor for nearly 1,000 years, commanding its armies, maintaining its defences, and preserving its laws, and they sat on a chair below the throne rather than on the throne itself, for they were custodians and not kings. The final centuries of the Third Age brought continuous pressure on Gondor's borders. Osgiliath became a ruin and a battleground, its bridges broken and its stones scattered. Minas Ithil was taken by the Nazgûl in 2002 and became Minas Morgul, the Tower of Sorcery, and the eastern border of Gondor was pushed back to the Anduin. Minas Anor was renamed Minas Tirith, the Tower of Guard, and it became the chief city and the seat of the stewards. Denethor, the last ruling steward, used the Palantir of Minas Tirith to watch the movements of the enemy, and Sauron used his own Palantir to feed Denethor images of despair, showing him the vast armies of Mordor and the hopelessness of resistance. Sauron's final war tested Gondor with the siege of Minas Tirith and the battle at Pelennor, where the forces of Mordor broke the gates, and the Rohirrim rode to the rescue, and Aragorn came up the river with the southern fiefs. Faramir, son of Denethor, defended the crossings of Osgiliath and was wounded by a dart of the Nazgûl, and Denethor, broken by the Palantir's visions and the apparent loss of his son, tried to burn himself and Faramir on a pyre, and he died in the flames. Aragorn came to Minas Tirith with the healer's hands and the banner of the White Tree, and the army of the west marched to the Black Gate and stood before the might of Mordor, and the ring was destroyed in the fires of Mount Doom, and Sauron fell. Aragorn Elessar was crowned King of Gondor and Arnor in the year 3019 of the Third Age, and the two kingdoms of the Dundine were reunited under a single ruler for the first time since the death of Isildur. He planted a new seedling of the White Tree in the court of the citadel, found by Gandalf on the slopes of Mindolluin, and the tree flowered for the first time in centuries. Faramir was appointed Prince of Ithilien, and the stewardship was preserved in his house as an office of honour. Aragorn made peace with the Haradrim and the Easterlings, and he retook Umbar and restored Gondor's dominion over the southern coasts, and the reunited kingdom entered the Fourth Age with its king restored and its enemies scattered. Harad is the name the Chronicles of Gondor give to the vast lands south of the kingdom, a region so large and so various that no single description can encompass it. The men of Harad, called Haradrim or Southrons by the soldiers of Gondor, were descended from the early peoples who spread south and east from Hildorien in the ages before the Edain came to Beleriand. Unlike the Edain, the Haradrim had no role in the wars of the First Age, and they entered the recorded history of the West only when the Númenorians began to explore and colonize the southern coasts of Middle-earth in the Second Age. The Númenorians established havens and trading posts along the shores of Harad, and the contact between the island kingdom and the southern peoples brought goods, weapons, and new technologies to the region, but it also brought domination and conflict. The king's men among the Númenorians treated the Haradrim as subjects and slaves, and the black Númenorians, who remained in the south after the downfall, continued to rule over the Haradrim with cruelty, using them as soldiers and labourers in their own wars against Gondor. The wars between Gondor and Harad stretched across the entire Third Age. The southern border of Gondor ran along the river Harnen, and the lands beyond that river changed hands many times as the two powers fought for control of the coastlands and the inland territories. King Hyamendasil I defeated the Haradrim in the 12th century and extended Gondor's sway deep into the south, and for centuries after that victory the Haradrim paid tribute to Gondor and acknowledged its overlordship. The kinstrife and the Great Plague weakened Gondor's hold on the south, and the Haradrim reclaimed much of their territory and resumed their raids across the Harnen. The corsairs of Umbar, many of whom were of Haradrim blood or had allied with the Haradrim against Gondor, attacked the coasts and drew Gondor's forces away from the eastern and northern frontiers. At Pelennor, the Haradrim marched to the siege of Minas Tirith in great numbers, and their cavalry and infantry formed a significant part of the army of Mordor. The Mumakil of Harad, enormous beasts that the men of the south tamed and rode to war, carried towers on their backs and trampled the soldiers of Gondor and Rohan beneath their feet. The Mumakil were the most feared of the Haradrim forces, and the horses of the Rohirrim shied from them and would not go near. A Haradrim soldier, described in the chronicles as a man of the south with a scarlet standard, fell before the charge of Theoden and the Rohirrim on the fields before the city, and the scarlet banners of the south were trampled in the mud. After the fall of Sauron, Aragorn Elessar made peace with the Haradrim, and the embassies of the reunited kingdom travelled south to renew relations with the peoples of Harad, whose names, cities, and internal histories the Western chronicles had never fully recorded. Umbar was a great natural harbour on the southern coast of Middle-earth, and its strategic position at the meeting of sea lanes and coastal trade routes made it one of the most contested places in the history of the West. The Númenorians established a haven at Umbar in the Second Age, and it became one of their chief ports and naval bases on the mainland. After the downfall of Númenor, the king's men who had settled in Umbar remained, and they became known as the Black Númenorians, and they used the harbour as a base for their power and their raids against the faithful who had founded Gondor and Arnor. The Black Númenorians of Umbar were among the most bitter enemies of Gondor, and they ruled the haven and the surrounding coastlands for centuries, maintaining the old pride and the old cruelty of the king's men. The kin strife of Gondor brought a new faction to Umbar. Castamir's sons and followers, driven from Gondor after the defeat and death of their father, fled to the haven and seized it from the older king's men. These exiles were of pure Númenorian blood, and they brought with them the ships and the naval tradition of Gondor, and they turned Umbar into a base for the corsair raids that would plague the southern coasts of Gondor for the rest of the Third Age. The corsairs of Umbar were not a race or a people, but a political and naval faction, composed of the descendants of Castamir's exiles and the Haradrim and other sailors who joined their crews. They raided the coastlands, burned the villages and towns along the shore, and carried off captives and goods, and their attacks drew Gondor's forces away from the eastern and northern frontiers where the Easterlings and the Wain Riders pressed. King Telumefta Umbardasil of Gondor attacked Umbar in the year 1810 of the Third Age, and captured the haven, driving out the corsairs and ending their raids for a time. The victory was not permanent. The exiles returned in later centuries, and the harbour changed hands again. Its position kept it at the centre of Gondor's southern wars, and during the War of the Ring the corsair fleet sailed north to pull defenders away from Minas Tirith. Aragorn, using the army of the dead, captured those ships and turned them against Mordor, carrying his forces to the Pelennor fields. After the war, Aragorn Elessar retook Umbar and restored Gondor's dominion over the haven, ending the corsair threat. Khand is a name that appears in the Chronicles of Gondor, with a sparsity that reflects the limits of Western knowledge. The lands of Khand lay to the southeast of Mordor, and the people who dwelt there were called the Variags. The geography, the cities, and the culture of Khand are almost entirely absent from the records that survive in the West, and the Variags enter the history of Middle-earth only through their military actions against Gondor and their service to Sauron. The sources do not describe a capital, a ruler, a religion, or a political system for Khand, and the gaps in the record are a feature of the chronicle rather than a deficiency to be filled with speculation. The Variags of Khand joined the alliance that struck Gondor in the year 1944 of the Third Age. The Wain Riders and the Easterlings launched a coordinated invasion from the east and the south, and the Variags marched with them. King Ondahur of Gondor had led his army north to meet the Wain Rider assault, and he was killed in Ithilien along with his 2 sons, and the northern defence of Gondor collapsed. The invaders camped in northern Ithilien, believing Gondor defeated, and held a feast to celebrate. Ernil, the general of the southern army, had been fighting the Haradrim on the southern front. He marched north with his forces and fell upon the camp by surprise. The eastern coalition scattered and fled, and that southern victory saved Gondor from the destruction the northern defeat had seemed to make certain. The Variags of Khand appeared again at Pelennor, marching among the armies of Mordor. They were held in reserve behind the main force, and they entered the battle as the fighting on the fields before Minas Tirith intensified. The arrival of Aragorn and the southern forces from the captured corsair fleet turned the battle, and the Variags were defeated along with the rest of Sauron's army. The fate of Khand after the fall of Sauron is uncertain, and the chronicles do not record whether the Variags made peace with the reunited kingdom or continued to resist. The silence of the sources on the internal life of Khand is a reminder that the histories of Middle-earth were written from the west, and the peoples of the east and south appear in them only when their paths cross the borders of the western kingdoms. Rohan was born from a military gift and sealed by an oath. The Rohirrim were a people of the Northmen, kin to the Edain who had gone to Númenor and to the men of Dale and the men of Esgaroth. The Northmen had dwelt in the lands of Rhudaur, east of Mirkwood and south of the Erebor, and they had been allies and kinsmen of Gondor for centuries, serving as a buffer against the Easterlings of Rhûn. The Wainriders devastated the Northmen in the 19th century of the Third Age, destroying their settlements and carrying off their people, and the survivors of the Wainrider Wars retreated northward to the upper waters of the Anduin. There, in the lands near the sources of the great river, they became known as the Eotheod, and their lords ruled a small but warlike people who kept horses and herds and remembered their old kinship with the men of the West. In the year 2510 of the Third Age, the Balcoth invaded the northern plains of Gondor, and the garrison of Cardolan could not hold them. Cirion, the steward of Gondor, sent messengers north to the Eotheod, and their lord Eorel answered the call. Eorel gathered his riders and rode south through the perilous lands of the Limelight and the Wold, and he arrived on the field of Celebrant at the moment when the Balcoth had crossed the Anduin and were pressing the defenders of Gondor back toward the river. The charge of the Eotheod broke the Balcoth and scattered the Easterling forces, and the riders of Eorel pursued them through the fields and the marshes until the invaders were destroyed. Cirion, in gratitude for the deliverance of Gondor, granted the land of Calenardon to Eorel and his people, and the Eotheod rode into their new homeland and renamed it the Mark of the Riders, and in the language of Gondor it was called Rohan. The oath that Cirion and Eorel swore at the tomb of Elendil on the hill of Halifirion bound the two kingdoms in alliance for the rest of the Third Age. Eorel swore that the Rohirrim would come to the aid of Gondor whenever the steward called, and Cirion swore that Gondor would come to the aid of Rohan whenever the king of the Mark requested. The oath of Eorel was renewed by the heirs of both kingdoms, and it was tested in the wars that followed. The Dunlendings, a people who dwelt in the mountains west of Rohan and who claimed the land of Calenardon as their own, raided the western marches of the Mark for centuries. The conflict between the Rohirrim and the Dunlendings was a feud of land and memory, for the Dunlendings believed that the Rohirrim had stolen their territory, and the Rohirrim defended the land that had been given to them by the steward of Gondor. King Helm Hammerhand of Rohan fought the Dunlendings in the long winter of 2758, when the Dunlending Lord Wolf seized Edoras and drove the Rohirrim into the mountains. Helm took refuge in the deep valley that would later bear his name, and he defended the fortress there through the winter, and his sons died in the cold and the fighting, and Helm himself froze to death standing in the snow, his fists clenched. The fortress of Helm's Deep and the deeping wall that protected it became the chief western defence of Rohan, and Helm's last stand became the founding legend of the kingdom's resistance. The Rohirrim drove the Dunlendings out and restored their kingdom, and the deeping wall stood through the centuries that followed as the barrier against the enemies from the west. Isengard, the fortress at the southern end of the Misty Mountains, had been built by the Númenorians of Gondor in the early days of the kingdom, and its Tower of Orthanc stood in the valley as a monument to the old power of the south. Saruman the White, one of the Istari, took Isengard as his seat, and for centuries he was trusted by the Rohirrim and the men of Gondor as a wise counsellor and a friend. In the late Third Age, Saruman turned against Rohan, and he gathered Orcs and Dunlendings in Isengard and launched an invasion of the Mark. Theoden, king of Rohan, had been weakened by the Council of Grima, Saruman's agent in Edoras, and the Rohirrim were divided and unprepared. Gandalf roused Theoden from his despair, and the king rode to Helm's Deep with the forces he could gather, and there the Rohirrim defended the deeping wall against the army of Saruman. The Ents of Fangorn Forest attacked Isengard and destroyed Saruman's works, and the threat from the south was ended. Theoden rode to the aid of Gondor at Pelennor, and his charge broke the forces of Mordor and saved Minas Tirith, and he fell in battle before the gates of the city, and Eomer, his nephew, took the throne and led the Rohirrim through the remainder of the war. Dale was a city of men, built in the valley of the river Running, beneath the slopes of the lonely mountain of Erebor. The men of Dale were Northmen, kin to the Rohirrim and to the men of Esgaroth, and they had dwelt in the region for generations before the founding of the city. The city of Dale grew wealthy through trade with the dwarves of Erebor, who had established their kingdom under the mountain in the Third Age, and who crafted goods of metal and stone that were traded through Dale to the lands of the east and the south. The relationship between Dale and Erebor was one of mutual benefit, and the men of Dale supplied food and goods from the lowlands, while the dwarves supplied weapons and tools and works of craft. Girion was the lord of Dale at the time of its greatest prosperity, and his city was filled with the sound of bells and the traffic of merchants, and the emerald necklaces and dwarf-wrought mail that came from Erebor passed through the hands of the men of Dale to the markets of the wider world. In TA 2770, the dragon Smaug came down from the north and attacked Dale and Erebor. The fire of the dragon swept over the city, and the men of Dale were killed or scattered, and Girion fell defending his people. The dwarves of Erebor were driven from their halls, and Smaug took the mountain for his own, and the wealth of the dwarves became his hoard. The survivors of Dale fled to the Long Lake, where they built the town of Esgaroth on pilings driven into the water, and there they lived as fishermen and traders, diminished from the prosperity of their old city, but preserving their community and their memory of what they had lost. Esgaroth was a town of men, built on the water and connected to the shore by a long bridge, and it was governed by a master elected from among the merchants and the householders. Bard, a descendant of Girion, lived in Esgaroth as a guardsman and a bowman when the company of Thorin Oakenshield came to the lake town in 2941. The dwarves' expedition to Erebor roused Smaug from his long sleep, and the dragon attacked Esgaroth in fury. Bard shot the black arrow, an heirloom of his family, into the weak spot on Smaug's breast, and the dragon fell and died, and the town was saved, though much of it had been burned. Bard used his share of the dragon's hoard to rebuild Dale, and the city rose again from its ashes, and Bard became its king. The dwarves of Dain Ironfoot reoccupied Erebor, and the old trade between the mountain and the city resumed, and Dale and Erebor flourished together in the years that followed. The Battle of Dale came during Sauron's last campaign, when an army of Easterlings struck the north. Brand, the son of Bard and king of Dale, and Dain Ironfoot, king of Erebor, fought side by side against the Easterling army, and the battle raged for 10 days. Brand fell, and Dain fell defending his body, and the men of Dale and the dwarves of Erebor were driven back into the mountain. The siege continued until the fall of Sauron, and when the news came that the ring had been destroyed, the Easterlings lost heart, and the besieged forces sallied out and broke the siege. Bard too, the son of Brand, became king of Dale, and the friendship between Dale and the reunited kingdom of Aragorn-Elessar was renewed, and the city and the mountain entered the Fourth Age in alliance and in peace. Bree was a settlement of men in the heart of Eriador, built around Bree Hill at the crossing of the Great Road and the road from the Shire to the south. The men of Bree were middlemen, descendants of the peoples who had dwelt in Eriador before the founding of Arnor, and they may have been related to the men of the White Mountains who had migrated north in the ages before the Númenorians came to Middle-earth. Bree was one of the oldest inhabited places in the region, and its people had lived there since before the kingdom of Arnor was established, and they remained there after Arnor fell and the rangers became the silent guardians of the land. The settlement was a village of men, but hobbits had settled beside them in the early centuries of the Third Age, and the two peoples lived in mixed households and shared the fields and the pastures around the hill. The Prancing Pony, the inn at Bree, served as the chief gathering place for travellers on the Great Road, and news from the east and the west passed through its doors. The rangers of the north patrolled the roads around Bree and kept the settlement safe from the dangers that had grown in the wilderness after the fall of Arnor. The villagers knew the rangers by sight, but not by name, and they regarded them with a mixture of respect and suspicion, for the rangers were a strange and wandering people who appeared and disappeared without warning. When Sauron's war reached Eriador, the danger on the roads increased, and the rangers were called away to the south, and Bree was left exposed to the ruffians and the spies who moved through the region in the service of Saruman and the enemy. The inn at Bree became a place of fear and suspicion, and the travellers who passed through brought news of war and darkness from every direction. After the restoration of the kingdom under Aragorn-Elessar, the men of Bree learned that the king had returned, and the rangers who had guarded their roads became the soldiers of the restored realm. The great road was repaired, and the traffic that had dwindled in the long years of the wilderness began to flow again, and the inn at Bree filled with travellers from the south and the east. The hobbits of Bree and the Shire remained in their own communities, and the men of Bree kept their own customs and their own village, and the two peoples continued to live side by side as they had for centuries. The king decreed that the Shire would be a free land under the protection of the Northern Crown, and the men of Bree found themselves inside the borders of a kingdom they had not known they were waiting for, and the road that ran through their village carried the news and the goods of a reunited realm. The men of Bree had never left the road. They had stayed through the centuries when the kings of Arnor ruled from Anominus, through the division and the wars with Angmar, through the long decline of the northern Dúnedain and the rise of the Rangers. Their settlement around Bree Hill was older than any kingdom that had claimed sovereignty over it, and the inn at the crossing of the Great Road had served travellers since the days when the road carried the traffic of a united realm. The hobbits who came to Bree in the early centuries of the Third Age found a village already old, already accustomed to strangers, and already rooted in a way of life that did not depend on the favour of kings. The prancing pony kept its doors open through the plague years and the war years, and the years of wilderness that followed the fall of Fornost, and the barleyman who poured beer for travellers from the Shire and the Blue Mountains and the distant south served them without asking which kingdom claimed the road they travelled. The rangers who patrolled the lands around Bree were the descendants of the kings of Arthedain, and they kept the settlements safe without announcing their presence or demanding tribute. The men of Bree saw them on the road and at the edges of the village, and they knew that the strange and weathered figures who passed through their streets were the reason the wolves and the trolls and the darker things that had crept into Erebor after the fall of Arnor did not reach the doors of Bree. The rangers asked nothing and offered nothing except their silent vigilance, and the men of Bree accepted that vigilance without understanding it. When the rangers departed south in the War of the Ring, the ruffians and the spies who moved through Erebor found the roads unprotected, and the village at Bree Hill felt the absence of its silent guardians in the fear that settled over the inn and the streets. The return of the king changed the road. Aragorn Elessar restored the northern kingdom and re-established the authority of the crown over the lands that had been the realm of Arnor, and the rangers who had guarded Bree became the officers and the soldiers of a reunited kingdom. The great road was repaired, and the traffic of merchants and travellers resumed, and the inn at Bree filled with people who brought news from the south and the east and the Shire. The men of Bree learned that the king had returned, and the road that ran through their village carried the goods and the word of a realm that stretched from the Blue Mountains to the Sea of Rhûn, and the settlement at Bree Hill found itself inside the borders of a kingdom for the first time in 1,000 years. The hobbits of Bree and the Shire remained in their own communities, and the men of Bree kept their village and their inn and their way of life, and the two peoples continued to live side by side as they always had, under the protection of a king who had walked among them as a ranger and who knew the road and the inn and the people of Bree Hill by name.